today on The Future of Everything, the future of elections. So at first glance, elections and voting seem pretty simple. You register with the local election authority, you figure out who you want to vote for, you show up and you vote. And then you find out the next day if any of your people or your causes won. That determines the details of how our society works and how things are going to go for the next period of time. But there are a lot of things behind that scene that can markedly affect this process and the outcomes that have huge consequences very often. Where do you vote? Typically, we think of this as being based on our address and will determine the precinct, the city, the town, the state, even the country whose elections and whose decisions you get to make. Do you show up in person or do you do an absentee ballot? Do you fill out little boxes with a little pen or do you press computer buttons? How can you be sure your vote is accurately counted? How are you allowed to support the causes you care about? With money, with social media, with where you stand and where you speak? How much can others try to influence how you vote and what you vote on? Should you be happy or sad that a fraction of eligible voters don't actually vote? And much of this boils down to the laws and regulations that govern elections and voting. Well, Nate Persily is a professor of law, communications, and political science, and a senior fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies at Stanford University. He writes and teaches about US elections and voting laws. He serves on advisory panels that draft some of these laws, and he studies the outcomes of the decisions made about elections and voting. Nate, what are some of the most important issues that are emerging in the area of voting and elections as you see it?
Well, thanks for having me. And on that question, I'd say, we learned a lot in this last election, in the 2020 election, which really was an earthquake from the standpoint of election administration and fundamentally changed how we are voting in much of the country. So although we might not have a pandemic to deal with in the next election, the sort of residual changes are going to have an effect for the foreseeable future. The most significant and obvious is the move to increase to vote by mail, and for that matter, the controversy surrounding it. And so for the first time, we had a majority of Americans who did not cast their ballot in an election day polling place. The plurality were voting by mail. Another group was voting, early in person. And then that sort of paradigm that you suggested earlier in the show, in your intro, about how you just show up to vote on election day, that's now becoming sort of the minority position when it comes to voting. And with those changes has come, all kinds of other variations. So people probably, when we talked about mail voting, people think it's about the mail, but now sizable sections of the population, while voting by mail, are really not using the postal service. They use drop boxes, they drop it off at offices and the like, causing all kinds of other issues from the standpoint of election administration. So that's the biggest change that we've seen in the last year. But this is accelerating trends that were already in the making, as well as sort of pointing toward a future where you're going to make a lot of different options when it comes to voting.
Now, I know that you've written, and I've read a little bit about your kind of postmortem on the 2020 election, and I was kind of pleased and surprised that much of what you wrote was that, based especially on how badly many of the primaries went, this election day was a pretty much of a success. Although there's this funny feeling, because of the news we've been hearing, that a lot of people did not consider it a success. And so, backing up from a historical perspective, is just the kind of thing that's been happening in the United States with kind of jockeying for positions and trying to turn knobs for political advantage? Or do you sense that there's a different pace and tenor of the current kind of battle for voting and election controls?
I think we've reached a new and dangerous stage in the way that we think about voting and confidence in democracy right now in the United States. It has always been the case that we've had sore losers, right? That those who lose an election are more likely to say that it was not free and fair.
Right.
But the partisan division in this country after the 2020 election was larger than anything that we've seen previously. So that, for example, When you ask people, was this election free and fair? 90% of Democrats will say that it was free and fair. Only 26% of Republicans in the wake of the 2020 election said it was free and fair. And so that really is a dangerous situation. It's one, obviously, that reached its pinnacle on January 6th, but continues to this day with Arizona, the sort of pretend audit that they're going through, as well as just large-scale disinformation about election fraud and the like. But it has been the case that the Democrats and Republicans have had growing sort of differences over voting, right? With Republicans emphasizing, integrity and Democrats emphasizing access. And that was not always the case, right? And in fact, you go back to the Dixiecrat days, right, in the South, which was dominated by the Democrats. The Democrats were really sort of agents of disenfranchisement and restriction and the like. But now you see this both at the elite level and then at the mass level, just fundamental differences over the process and infrastructure of voting and what we should do about it.
And so I just want to, I don't want to press you too much, but I just want to press, because I recently read some biographies of Theodore Roosevelt and some of the robber baron times at the end of the 19th century. And I just want to press you that even then, with the things that were going on, as you pointed out, in the South, and with the divisions in the country over many, many issues, would they, even then, would you say that the pressures on the election system were not as great and persistent as they are right now?
Well, no, I mean, let's be clear about what the sweep of American history tells us, right? The story of enfranchisement in America is an incremental story, right, which starts with white male property owners being the polis, being the only people that mattered politically because they were given the right to vote.
Right.
And then very slowly but surely the franchises expanded, first largely eliminating the property qualifications, then of course the Civil War and the post-Reconstruction amendments, but then the retrenchment that followed, granting women the right to vote, later lowering the age of the voting age to 18, the Voting Rights Act, right? There's a whole story of that I teach in my class here at Stanford on the law of democracy, about the enfranchisement, the slow march toward political equality. What we're seeing now, though, is different in that the sort of partisan valence to a lot of these nitty-gritty questions of election administration does seem like it's a difference in kind. Mm-hmm. To be sure, you go back to the progressive era, and there's plenty of examples of party corruption with party machines and different parties trying to clean up the system. And so, in the U.S. as elsewhere, there's always a kind of pace of reform and retrenchment. But this is, as sort of the uniqueness of January 6th suggests, right? The public perception of what the problems on the election system is reaching kind of new depths.
This is The Future of Everything. I'm Russ Altman. I'm speaking with Nate Persily from Stanford Law School about all of the myriad challenges that we're seeing to elections and voting. So I have this list of topics that we literally have no ability to get through. I'm just looking at them because I wanted to talk about voting rights and suppression, political parties and their basis, campaign financing, redistricting, election administration, and technology. You've kind of told me that there is a different sense and the use of partisanship. I guess my question is, what should a regular voter who is concerned about the integrity of the voting system, which of these topics is the one that kind of we should worry about or be the most vigilant about? Is that even a fair question?
Yeah, sure, it's a fair question. I mean, sort of ironically, the thing we should be worrying about are people's worries. And by that, I mean that in some ways, it's the lack of confidence in the system that is providing the biggest problem, because democracies don't survive when you have losers who are unwilling to accept the outcome. And so when it comes to the actual mechanics, the administration of the election, the 2020 election is an incredible success story. And we had record voter turnout. We had very few problems by, whether you're talking about the in-person voting experience or the mail voting experience. Many of us who were worried and warned about, for example, millions of canceled ballots because of signature mismatches, or, other kinds of problems with, not having social distancing, having too few poll workers, which was something we were really worried about in this election, because older people tend to be poll workers and they were less likely to serve because of the risk of contagion. And so from the administration perspective, this was this heroic achievement. And so I think it's important for us to build confidence in the actual administration of the election. I am worried that because of the fallout of this election, that you will see more hardcore partisans getting into the business of election administration, whether it's running for secretaries of state or even becoming local election officials. Yeah. Because we are seeing thousands of veteran election officials resign after the controversies and difficulties of this election. And so if they are replaced by people who are less sort of public spirited and management oriented, I think that's a real concern.
Yeah, so I wanted to follow up on that, because I have been impressed just looking at the news that especially, as we all know, the Republicans have been complaining about the election integrity and raising the most questions. And yet I've seen more Republican elections officials staunchly defending their counts and their processes. And I'm just wondering, they're kind of heroes in this situation. And what I just heard you say is that they're a threatened species, because at a certain point you don't want to take it anymore. You're doing your best and you're still getting criticized. So how can we be vigilant to make sure that we have these kind of very upstanding, principled people running elections from both parties?
Well, first of all, that you're right. It's both Republicans and Democrats right now who I think are saying it's not worth it. That we don't want to stay in this position. The death threats, aren't, the pay doesn't match the level of danger here. And so the Republicans who stood up to the president, and people like Brad Raffensperger in Georgia, and even listen right now to the Maricopa County supervisors, right, who are saying that there was no problem in the Arizona election. These are, and the fellow in Michigan who and it was on the accounting board who stood up, all very important folks. And so what can we do? Well, we need to push for sort of a sort of greater professionalism and route sort of pathway to election administration as a career. That means getting some universities to sort of take this on as a master's degree. It means trying, as best we can through legal changes and reform to push for these people to be insulated from politics.
So forgive me for not even knowing this, but are these folks typically elected or appointed? I mean, it's probably variable, but what's the general way that people get into these positions of being the administrator of elections for a state or a district?
So in general, the secretaries of state tend to be elected. The state election directors are appointed, okay, right? So they work usually together. The local election, the local election officials, it is quite variant, right? Most of the time, I'd say that they are appointed, sometimes appointed on a partisan basis, but a lot of them are civil servants, right? I mean, I should say this, that the majority of county election officials, right, the overwhelming majority of people who are in charge of a county's election system are people for whom election administration is a part-time job. Right. So most counties, it doesn't make a difference because it's the recorder of deeds, the chief notary, so people like that. But that's also because, in 80% of the counties, it's fewer than 50% of the people, so in the rural areas, it's not treated as significantly as it in the big urban centers. And those tend to be, it really just depends on the state as to whether they're appointed or whether they're elected. Here in California, for example, they're appointed. In other parts of the country, they're elected. or appointed by a governor, on a partisan basis.
Right. So there are elected officials, presumably partisan, who have some inputs into this process, and that's what we would want to take a look at. On the other hand, there are privileges associated with winning an election, and you have to. I can see how it's a balance, but I actually have a question that I've been wondering about and let me just ask it to you, because so I've been watching, and as we know, it's mostly Republican-led houses that are looking at new laws for changing the voting mechanisms in their states, and it looks to be, and I must say, and people will have to forgive me if I'm characterizing this wrong, it looks to be because they don't like what happened recently, and they're trying to change it because they have worries about integrity. But my question is, have they thought carefully, in your estimation, about whether these techniques that they're using could backfire on them? Because I'm thinking, you're turning knobs that really you might have no idea how that might affect the outcome of elections. And it would not be the first time that people thought they were engineering something in their own favor, and they actually were hurting themselves. And so I just wanted to ask if you're seeing any of that, or if that's like a possibility, or are they much more careful and they really know what they're doing?
So they're certainly not careful. I'll say two things. First, what you describe as backfire can happen in two ways. The first is that the law is going to have its intended effect, but what unintended effect is that Democrats get so angry about it that then they turn out in droves.
Right.
And there are plenty of examples of that. The second is that the law has an intended effect, and they actually kill off their own voters, right?
Exactly.
That they end up that it actually has that unintended effect that they're not sort of aware of. And so take mail balloting, for example. For many years, up and really until the 2008 election, mail balloting was predominantly Republican. Republicans were most in favor of it. One of the reasons the voter ID movement, which was really the way we thought about it, sort of the paradigmatic example of voting restrictions until recently, although still recently, it didn't apply to mail balloting. And that was because in a lot of these states, the Republicans were the ones who were voting by mail. Now the Democrats have been voting more by mail. A lot of that has to do with the fact that the Western states, which are heavily Democratic, have moved to all vote by mail. And so if you just look at the aggregate statistics, you'll end up seeing greater mail voting by Democrats. After this election, there's just a greater lack of confidence among Republicans in mail voting for all the reasons that President Trump has said. But on your basic question, I think there is a significant possibility that this mobilizes Democrats, because on the sort of vote suppression theme. Importantly, it's not clear which elections they will get mobilized and angry. So my personal view is a lot of these laws have no effect in a presidential election where everybody is interested and probably going to turn out, but in these kind of local elections or in off-year elections, they might have some effect on turnout.
This is The Future of Everything. I'm Russ Altman. More with guest Nate Persily about voting in elections next on Sirius XM. Welcome back to The Future of Everything. I'm Russ Altman. I'm speaking with Nate Persily about voting in elections. And one thing we didn't talk about at all in the first segment is the role of social media and the internet and Facebook and Twitter. And does this get on your radar as a lawyer thinking about elections and votes, or is this somebody else's problem?
No, it's definitely my problem. I direct the Cyber Policy Center here at Stanford and the program on democracy and the internet. So one of the big changes in elections over the last 5 to 10 years has been the role of social media. I mean, most notably after the 2016 election, people began to become very concerned about foreign interference in US elections because of the Russian incursion. And so that became the sort of singular focus in the wake of that election. But since then, of course, we've been worried about disinformation, incitement, all kinds of other aspects of social media conversation and how they're affecting elections, as well as, say, online political advertising. So, social media has completely transformed elections, and we are still trying to struggle with how we should regulate it.
And it doesn't take an experienced lawyer like yourself to know that this gets very close to First Amendment issues and freedom of speech without too many hops, skips, and jumps. So let me ask you, recently there was a Facebook decision about Donald Trump's access to Facebook. Twitter also took some measures in light of the January 6th insurrection. When you see that as a lawyer, how do you deconstruct that in terms of what's going on and where the law and legal principles might be applicable?
Well, what Facebook did is that they have this oversight board that they've appointed, which is trying to sort of be independent of Facebook to evaluate its content moderation decisions. And so, as you said, what they decided was that Facebook's ban on Trump's account would be sustained for now, but within 6 months, Facebook has to reevaluate whether the sort of clear and present danger that existed on January 6th still exists and justifies the account takedown. Twitter has indefinitely banned Donald Trump's account. So has YouTube, but YouTube says it's continually sort of asking that same question as to whether current conditions justify it. And so the First Amendment applies to government regulation of speakers. And one of the things we're realizing is that in many ways, these large platforms are as powerful as governments, and that governments are unable or unwilling to sort of craft clear rules for them as to how they should regulate elections, how they should regulate hate speech, disinformation, and the like. And so we've essentially outsourced a large section of our election administration regulation to these private companies whose interests are different than democratically accountable governments.
Now, how does this interact with the various rulings that have been coming from the Supreme Court about companies and PACs, political action groups and their funding sources? It seems like this is the next chapter in the increasing influence of corporations on the election system. And I make that connection, but I don't actually know if there is a connection there. Is there?
Well, there is, because not only do Facebook and Google and Twitter affect speech, but they also possess speech rights as companies, right? So that Citizens United, the much maligned and famous decision dealing with corporate campaign finance, held that corporations are constitutionally protected when they want to run ads advocating for the election or defeat a candidate. So if Facebook's allowed to run as many ads as it wants, saying vote for or vote against a candidate, then the question is, well, then are they able, does that same speech right give them unfettered moderation prerogatives, to decide what speech is allowed on the platform and how sort of the message that comes out of it? Now, as you know, and as sort of contemporary debate has dealt with, there are several different types of questions here. One is the rights of the corporations. The other is like, what legal regime should determine their content moderation and how much liability should they have? So Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which has been much in the news, in the last few years, is what immunizes Facebook and Google and these other platforms, as well as local websites that have a social media component to them. It immunizes them from liability for what you might say on the platform, right? So that iTunes will not be liable for the stuff that you might put on your show.
Stuff that I sing.
What? Unless you sing.
The stuff that I might sing, iTunes won't be responsible for that. No.
And so there are all those kinds of questions that are there, but fundamentally, the problems that we see from a democracy perspective when it comes to social media are not illegal things that are going on the platforms. It's what we call sort of, harmful but not illegal speech. So whether it's disinformation or whether it's hate speech, generally speaking, that kind of speech is constitutionally protected in the U.S. And so we've left it up to the companies to decide what the rules of the road are on their platforms. And they frankly don't want that responsibility, but it's not clear that the government constitutionally can do it under the First Amendment.
Right. So we have this catch-22, and we've even heard Mark Zuckerberg asking for regulation, which people have their different interpretations of what that means when he does that at a congressional hearing. Is it clear to you what the way forward is? You just kind of almost described a catch-22, not quite, but you didn't give us a lot of working room in the box that you just drew for us. Is it I mean, is it the power of the consumer to walk away from these social media platforms? Is it going to become a back and forth with different administrations leading different types of legislation that either free or make less free these social media companies? What would you tell a young person who wants to have a career addressing this issue?
Well, first of all, it depends which problem you want to solve, right? So we sort of talked at a high level here about the kind of dangerous speech that's online, but that's not, I mean, there's a lot of dangerous speech that's on cable television too, right? Our politics right now is incredibly polarized and caustic, and social media is a component of that, maybe an accelerant.
Yeah.
But it's not the cause of a lot of this dangerous talk that's out there. So let's start with that as first principle. Secondly, we should regulate the platforms. We should regulate them regardless of their impact on elections, although that would be a component of it, whether it's through antitrust and breaking some of the companies up or regulating them more like public utilities, or whether it is having rules for political advertising or advertising transparency or transparency generally. You know, one of the things I've been working on for many years with the platforms is trying to get researchers access to what's going on the platforms in order to ensure that we know actually what the problems are. And finally, you know, privacy regulation is also on the agenda, because that is sort of what really makes Google and Facebook distinct, is the hoovering up of data that then is turned over or employed for advertising.
You know, as I hear you say this, I remember that, you know, I'm older, and I remember that there were regulations about television and radio that I think pretty severely constricted what they could allow to go out on the air. Is it a similar set of principles that then would be transferred and applied? In other words, what I mean is the legal basis for the government controlling television and radio, would that be a similar basis for the social media, or do we have to invent entirely new kind of legal frameworks for this regulation?
I think we need to invent new frameworks, but there's a genuine debate about this. I think that broadcast is a fundamentally different medium than social media and the internet. When you provide a venue for everybody in the world to speak, that's different than sort of organized programming on radio or on TV, where you are deciding sort of what product to deliver to your audience.
Yeah, and an unhappy regulator only had 3 phone numbers they had to call for CBS, NBC, and ABC, whereas now you would need literally billions of phone numbers.
And that's kind of the question: is do we think of these large monopolies like Facebook and Google like ABC, CBS, and NBC, or are they more like settings for individual discussion, right? And this is, you know, Republicans and Democrats don't agree on much, but they do agree on their hatred of big tech right now. The problem is that they hate them for different reasons. And so you can't, you know, the Republicans think that you've got liberal Californians who are determined, you know, kicking conservatives off the internet. And the Democrats think that these are firms that are allowing sort of untold amounts of hate speech, incitement, and disinformation. And you cannot solve both of those problems at once, right? Because if you're going to force greater content moderation, it's likely going to have a partisan effect. And so, you know, we're really in a bind here when it comes to regulating, you know, speech online.
Well, thank you for listening to The Future of Everything. I'm Russ Altman. If you missed any of this episode, listen anytime on demand with the SiriusXM app.